nowadays when anyone is clicking, if he's really ticking, then they say he's cooking with gas. Makes no difference what he may be doing, if he's really stewing, that's the way he's cooking with gas.
Gas! Cooking with gas.
Cooking with gas.
We all cook better when we're cooking with gas.
Gas is so hot it's not on when it's off. It's the only way to cook. That's what I was taught.
Today, where food is finest, it's cooked with gas. And here's Miss Julia Mead to show you why.
Hello. Look at my collection of famous menus. New York's Store Club, Chicago's Pump Room, Romanoff's in Hollywood, and Antoine's in New Orleans. They certainly bring back memories of wonderful meals. Meals, I'm proud to say, cooked with gas.
Natural gas is lively, the flame that will obey, just the way you want it, right away. Natural gas,
The only source of energy that has ever given you instant cooking control is the same source of energy that gives you the comfort of instant heating and hot water 24 hours a day. Pure, clean, instant, natural gas. Always there whenever you need it. Now, more than ever, because it also keeps your energy costs under control. For cooking, heating, and hot water, you're better off with natural gas.
God.
Barbecue the whole year round.
Barbecue all year round with a gas range. The separate broiler on your gas range has an open flame, the only way to broil, and gives your favorite foods that flame-kissed flavor. And there's no smoke. The clean blue flame of gas eliminates all the smoke when broiling. Really delicious. Flame-kissed with all the flavors still there. You'll be proud to serve guests or family flame-kissed food from your gas range broiler.
open flame cooking on your gas range. Cook better with gas.
Hey, everybody. Welcome. Really, really glad you're all here. Excited to have some extraordinary experts with us. One thing I have to note is that Jill, who was supposed to be presenting on her paper that she's been putting together with the data from many of the tests that we've done at your homes, got food poisoning and is in the hospital and couldn't be here, but we're going to try and update you sort of as best we can. But it was glad for you to see those ads and learn that natural gas cooking destroys all smoke, so it's totally safe. And to back up those advertising claims, I'm excited to present Yannai Kashtan with you. Yannai?
Thank you, Tim. So yeah, on behalf of the American Gas, sorry, excuse me. My name is Yannai Kashtan, and I'm an air quality researcher at PSE Healthy Energy. We're a nonprofit research institute. And yeah, I did my PhD basically on gas stoves and have been continuing research on indoor air quality and gas since then. So I'm going to share a little bit about what we've been researching and what we've been finding. Thanks so much for that kind intro, Tim. Can you all see the, whoops, looks like there we go. Hold on. Technical difficulties. I promise this worked in rehearsal. Okay. Are we good? Great. So, gas stoves, we know roughly that if you're on this call, you probably have a sense that they're not great for the climate. They're probably not great for your health, but what are the details? So I'm going to give you about 25-ish odd minutes on both the details of some of our findings and also a little bit of historical perspective, and then I'm going to throw it back to the rest of our wonderful presenters. So just a bit on PSE. Yeah, we're kind of academic adjacent, but we're a nonprofit energy, science, and policy research institute. We've done a lot of indoor air quality, but more broadly kind of looking at the science on how the fossil fuel system interacts with public health and the environment. So right now I'm going to talk about a bunch of different pollutants, and I like to group them into two major categories. There's all of the ones that are going to harm you right now, and I'm going to spend most of the time talking about that. That's things like benzene, other hazardous air pollutants, and nitrogen dioxide. And then there's methane and carbon dioxide that are not toxic to your body in the concentrations we typically observe in homes, but they're not great because they're major greenhouse gases and contribute to climate change. Climate and health. And gas appliances, stoves in particular, emit both of these categories of pollutants through two major methods. Gas itself contains some of these. It's mostly methane, 90+% methane, but it also contains benzene and other hazardous air pollutants like hexanes, for instance. And whenever you have a gas leak, whether that's coming from your stove or elsewhere, you also, along with the methane, get these other pollutants. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then, of course, when you actually burn the gas, when you're using your gas stove, it produces a lot of pollution, both carbon dioxide, which is the primary combustion product. There's also additional unburned methane that's emitted. And then there's things like nitrogen dioxide and benzene that are actually produced from the combustion itself. So this is kind of just an overview of where we're going to go today. I'm going to start on the climate end briefly, but then spend most of the time with health. So yeah, just a brief overview, a little bit on climate change, NO2, then we're going to move on to benzene from both the combustion and from the leaks themselves. All right, so what do we know about greenhouse gas emissions and climate from gas stoves? Previous work done in Rob Jackson's group by a close collaborator of mine, Eric LaBelle, and other colleagues, showed that when you have a stove in your house, it's off and mostly, in most cases, leaking 24/7. These are leaks that are small enough that it's not gonna trigger an explosion risk or anything. You're not gonna be able to detect them or smell them most of the time, but cumulatively overall, they do contribute to the total greenhouse gas emissions of that stove. So much so that if you look at the total emissions, the total methane emissions of the gas stove, the methane emissions when it's just sitting in a steady state off are the majority of its methane emissions. The emissions while on are small, just because for most people, their stove is just sitting there off most of the time. And this is based on actual leakage that we've measured in real stoves in real people's homes. So putting some other numbers on this, we have this expressed in gigagrams, which is very wonky, but perhaps a more accessible number is that's around 500,000 gasoline-powered cars. Just from stoves kind of leaking methane when they're off. So I think, this is important to understand. It's not just about what you do and the immediate behavior. Some of these emissions just come from the system itself, right? It doesn't matter what you do, the stove is just sitting there. And the methane emissions from just sitting there and leaking are so high that it actually boosts the total climate impact of a gas stove, including the carbon dioxide, which is the primary endpoint, by 40%, because methane is such a potent greenhouse gas. So I just wanted to give that snapshot because, again, here we're mostly talking about health, but it's also, of course, climate change does affect human health as well, and so it's important to think about these greenhouse gases as well. But now let's get to the main issue, which is the health impacts, the direct health impacts. So we're going to talk about nitrogen dioxide, and NOx is just a term for nitrogen dioxide plus its cousin nitrogen or nitric oxide. And I'm going to focus on nitrogen dioxide today. So the emission pathway here is when you've got that gas flame on, it's emitting nitrogen dioxide and then affecting health directly. And here is a nice little schematic that my colleague produced. You've got your gas stove. You got this plume. We know there's carbon dioxide, but we really wanted to know what the heck else is in this plume. That's really what kind of started all of this, because we knew there was methane, but what else, right? And so to answer that question, we have this suite of scientific analyzers that look somewhat sci-fi when I first saw them. This blue box here on the right is that's what's measuring the nitrogen dioxide, and then this big old green box is what measures benzene. So it's kind of fun and occasionally tedious to be working with them. But what they allow us to do is actually measure with pretty good precision the actual emission rate of these pollutants. So this plot is basically showing you on the y-axis the flow of NOx, which is the sum of NO and NO2 from the gas stove versus the total gas flow. And what you see is a nice straight line. That's really useful for us because it means if you tell me how much gas you burned, I can tell you exactly how much, or roughly how much NO2 came out. And then we can put that into all sorts of indoor air quality models to actually estimate how much of that NO2 are you breathing in, right? So this is a really good foundation for the models. But on its own, this number isn't very meaningful from a health perspective because it's not telling you how much is going actually into your lungs, right? And so just to give a kind of a sense of that, as an anecdote first, and then we're going to get into more systematic answer to this question of how much NO2 are we actually breathing in. These are real-time traces from 2 homes using our research-grade analyzers. This home here on the left, we had just a gas oven. And we're comparing here the NO2 levels with the hood off versus the hood on. This is a hood that actually vents outdoors, so it's doing what it's supposed to do. And our conclusion from this test here on the left is, hey, the hood, an outside venting hood helps, right? It's reducing the peak NO2 concentrations, but just by having an oven on, it's not enough necessarily to bring those concentrations down below health benchmarks. You can see that even this brown trace, even with the hood on, it's exceeding that 1 hour, 100 part per billion benchmark for pretty much close to an hour. We just cut the test off at an hour. Obviously, it would just continue if we had continued the test. So that's one little snapshot. And then on the right, there's another house, this time with the recirculating hood. This is a hood that runs the exhaust through a filter and spits it right back out at you. And we empirically showed that this type of hood, at least in the houses that we tested, basically just smooths out the concentrations. You can see the brown line is less jagged than the black line, but basically does nothing for NO2. So just an important indication that just having a hood is helpful if it vents outside, but not sufficient to guarantee that you're below health benchmarks. So those are kind of interesting anecdotes and showed like this. There's definitely a there, but it's not telling us kind of on a population level, what are people being exposed to? And so then what we did is we took indoor air quality model, our own NO2 measurements, and then we combined a bunch of data sets that are published and available on all these kinds of things that would affect, that basically stand in between NO2 being emitted from a stove and it being inhaled by a person and going into their lungs that would affect their exposure. And so we put our own findings, our own emission rates, plus all this other data into this model called CONTAM and combined that with data on housing stock and things in REX, which is this national database, to produce this population-wide estimate of exposure. So what popped out the other side? Well, a couple of interesting things. This map is nothing new. This isn't from the model itself, but just to illustrate as a baseline, these are the outdoor NO2 concentrations. And I think it's really important to look at this as a baseline because a lot of times when you're thinking about NO2 or these pollutions, you're just thinking about outdoor concentrations. And the point I want to make here with our whole model and this population level analysis is, especially if you have a big indoor source of a pollutant, it's not enough just to look at the outdoor concentrations to know what people are actually breathing in. So this is the outdoor concentration. If you then say, okay, given that most people spend most of their time indoors, and given that not all of that outdoor pollution actually makes it indoors, what is the exposure? Not the concentration, but what is the exposure to NO2 due to these outdoor sources? That's road traffic, power plants, all of that. And you can see it's less. That's not so surprising because, right, not all of that in outdoor NO2 makes it indoors. But this, map B is more representative of what people are actually breathing in from outdoor sources. And then you can ask, well, what if you add back in the primary indoor source for NO2, which is the gas stove, with our fancy indoor air quality model? And now you can see that the exposure goes back up again. Again, you can see a lot of geographic variation. Partly that's due to the outdoor concentrations varying, but also because all else equal, you'll be breathing in more NO2 from a gas stove if you live in a smaller apartment, for instance, because that same pollution has less volume to dilute itself in. So then you get a map like this, and you can see the exposures. And what I found really impactful is we can actually say, all right, what is the exposure if you cook a lot, right? We can vary this by how much gas you actually burn. If you're in the top 5% of gas cooks, residential gas cooks, this bottom right is what your exposure looks like. Much higher, and it really is actually higher than the exposure from all these outdoor sources combined. So I think these maps are kind of interesting because you can actually zoom in and look at zip codes and all that, and that's all publicly available online. We can follow up with that. But in aggregate, what did we find? So here, this is kind of a bar chart that's trying to summarize everything nationally. On the left, you see just on average, if you have a gas stove and you cook, well, normally in the 50th percentile, let's say, then about 3/4 of your NO2 exposure comes from all outdoor sources combined, and about 1/4 from the gas stove. I found this pretty surprising, considering this one tiny appliance is like punching above its weight in a bad way compared to road traffic, power plants, everything like that combined. And then if you're in an urban area, it's, you get more from outdoor just because you have more NO2 in the outdoor air. And then conversely, in a rural area with cleaner outdoor air, more of your exposure comes from a gas stove. And then here we compared as a function of gas stove use. And this plot, the second from the right bar, I really want to highlight because this shows that if you're cooking a lot, if you're in the top, if you're cooking for a big family, you're in the top 5% of gas stove users, the majority of your NO2 exposure comes from that one appliance. So it really is disproportionate. And then the rightmost bar is really just making the point, look, electric stoves don't emit NO2. So if you have an electric stove, all your NO2 exposure is coming from outdoor. Of course, I'm going to go relatively quickly over this because we have a medical expert on the panel. We're very fortunate. But obviously, the reason we care about all of this is because of the health impacts. So one of the most studied health impacts for NO2 is pediatric asthma. And based on epidemiological data that already exists and our exposure model, we calculate that round about 50,000 pediatric asthma cases are attributable to just the NO2 exposure from gas stoves. And then that number quadruples if you include the entire effects of gas stoves, all the other pollutants and everything. It's not just asthma. The data on mortality due to respiratory issues, be it asthma or COPD, for instance, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. The confidence intervals are larger, the uncertainties are larger, but there's still strong evidence showing that NO2 is bad for just overall mortality. And so we put kind of a very broad ballpark number of around 20,000 annual deaths being attributable to NO2 from gas stoves. There are some caveats around this that are important to note, which we can discuss more in the Q&A, but if we have to put a kind of ballpark number, this is what it would be. And then moving on, again, thinking about combustion products, but moving on from NO2, the other big one we've been focusing on because of its toxicity is benzene. So again, this is when it's being used. Benzene is formed from the actual combustion process itself. And this, how am I doing on time, Tim, by the way? Great. So this plot is just making the point, not about concentrations, but just making the point, gas and propane stoves emit benzene, induction stoves emit none, coil stoves emit basically a trivial amount just due to little bits of oil and organic matter burning off the coil. Again, like the NO2, these emission rates are great and they're kind of the core building block of models for exposure, but alone they don't tell us the concentrations you're actually breathing in. And so to get a sense of that, these are the concentrations of benzene we measured in various different kitchens as background in yellow, and then 45 minutes after of gas stove or oven use later. And what's different about benzene than NO2 is that benzene is like roulette. NO2 is very predictable. You tell me how much gas you burned, I'll tell you how much NO2 was emitted because of the combustion process. And I have a chemistry background, so I kind of want to go down that nerd rabbit hole, and I'm avoiding the urge. Benzene is produced differently through a much more chaotic process that we can discuss in Q&A. So some stoves burn quite cleanly and don't emit much benzene, but in about a third of cases, for various reasons, some of which we don't fully understand, they're big benzene emitters, and they're actually exceeding California's 8-hour reference exposure level. We found that concentrations can linger quite a bit, and it also exceed concentrations you typically find in secondhand smoke. So in about a third of cases, you're just unlucky, and we really can't predict which of those stoves is going to be a big emitter. And this plot here is now a plot of 6 different kitchens over time, measuring concentrations in bedrooms. So that was the kitchen. These are bedrooms, and this plot is really just making the point for these 6 houses with the oven on. In about 3 of the cases, they're not big benzene emitters. Okay, so we have just more or less background benzene concentrations the whole time. But in 3 cases, when you do have a benzene emitter, those concentrations, even in the bedroom, can spike up quite high, not just in the kitchen. And then if you don't have active ventilation, then they can stay elevated for quite some time. Here we measured it 8 entire hours, and we're making the point that these are exceeding certainly California's 8-hour reference exposure level, and in one case, California's acute reference exposure level, as well as some guidelines outside the US. So that was benzene produced when you burn gas. But in every case we've measured, there's actually just benzene in the gas to begin with. So you don't even have to burn it to make benzene. This applies to any time the gas leaks. Whenever you're getting a gas leak, you also get benzene, you also get hexane, you also get toluene, you get these other hazardous air pollutants. Again, I'm focusing today on benzene because the ratio of how much you get out from the gas to its toxicity is the highest. So we should be the most worried about it from the compounds we've measured. And this is actually kind of interesting, both from a health perspective, but also just kind of a nerdy scientific perspective. We measured benzene and gas in quite a few different cities. Starting out, actually, a colleague measured benzene concentrations in Boston, and there the shock was, oh my God, there's benzene in the gas. And so then we expanded and measured in a bunch of other cities, and then the surprise was, oh my God, there's a lot of benzene in the gas. There can be substantial amounts, and it varies dramatically by orders of magnitude depending on where you are, seemingly with the Western US having higher levels than the East Coast. And so then we went even further to Europe, and then the finding was, oh my God, the values in the UK and Amsterdam make the values even on the West Coast of the US look quite puny, to the point that in Europe, in about 9% of cases, we estimate that just leaking gas from a stove is enough to boost your indoor benzene concentration above health benchmarks. That's how much benzene is in the gas, just from a leaking stove in about 9% of cases. So obviously the concentrations vary dramatically, but we also have found benzene in every sample that we've measured. This is just making the point, if you know the concentration of benzene in the gas and you know the rate of the leak, then you can model what the resulting concentration of benzene would be in the kitchen, accounting for ventilation and kitchen size and all that stuff. And so here is what we actually did quantitatively in Europe for each column represents an actual kitchen where we measured the actual leak rate. And then just did that very basic analysis of, we know the leak rate, we know the benzene concentration, so here's what kind of the benzene enhancement you'd get in the kitchen. And as you can see, in some cases, we're exceeding the EU annual benzene limit and the World Health Organization's threshold of 1 in 100,000 leukemia cases if exposed for your lifetime, which is a pretty common benchmark. So just having the gas stove can be dangerous, again, depending on where you live, but especially if you live in places with a lot of benzene in their gas. Okay, so it's just some big picture takeaways from all of this, and then I'll do very briefly in a little bit of history. Here again is all the ways that the gas system affects us, both in terms of climate and health. And a big point about these components in leaking in the gas itself is it's not just the stove, right? Any point you get a gas leak, you're getting these pollutants co-emitted. And lots of research has shown that the gas system from production all the way down to delivery is pretty darn leaky all the way throughout. So just important to note, whenever you get methane, you get hazardous air pollutants as well. So a little bit of history and context. We saw this lovely video at the beginning, Cooking with Gas advertisement. But I just want to take a step back briefly and show that this is not new. The work we and our colleagues are doing is putting a much finer lens on the issue, but just the basic idea that burning gas indoors is a bad idea, not new. This is from 1839, Institution of Civil Engineers, and they're saying that the injurious effects of an excess of nitrogen and carbonic acid gas are too well known to require comment. Nitrogen acid gas is what is the old-fashioned name for NOx. Fast forward to 1907. This is the second annual meeting of the National Gas Association of America, which is the predecessor to the American Gas Association, and their vice president is condemning any use of any gas appliance without a flue connection, without a vent. Well, here we are today with unvented gas stoves. And their president says the association is going to go on record, no gas of any kind should go into a heating stove without a flue connection. And it wasn't just talk. Early on, you can see gas. This is a gas stove from the 1920s with indeed a flue connection to the outside. But during this period, as North America was getting off of wood and coal and increasingly switching to gas and electricity were in kind of a race. And the gas industry did get a bit worried and began quite an aggressive ad campaign. For instance, here with Bob Hope using the phrase cooking with gas on his show. The percent of homes with gas stoves started out relatively high, near 50% in the early 20th century, but began a precipitous decline with electricity winning. This was accelerated by various things. For instance, this is Ronald Reagan advertising GE's all-electric home. You can see these concentrations, or the percentage of new homes with gas stoves falling still. And then you had the very first studies in the 70s coming out directly linking gas stoves and asthma. And so the gas industry did not sit idly by. They hired the PR firm Hill & Knowlton, which is the same PR firm that advised tobacco on their strategies in the 1950s. And they enacted what they called Operation Attack, which had multiple prongs. One was pretty old-fashioned product placement, like paying for Julia Child's all-gas kitchen, some very dubious advertising claiming gas is a renewable resource, but also more classic kind of tobacco type tricks, giving little, in their words, not mine, giving little twists to the facts of science to convert them into sales propaganda, which is just directly from a Hill & Knowlton memo, the same PR firm retained by the gas industry. So Hill & Knowlton had some clear recommendations for the gas industry. They want them to create a separate research committee or institute with some distance from the industry, publicize the results of this industry-sponsored research as much as they could, consistently argue skeptically, emphasizing uncertainty at every point, and then not to stop. Even if the immediate crisis is averted, keep going. And so they put this strategy into action with various reviews that emphasized inevitable uncertainty in the science, because science inevitably focuses on areas of uncertainty and then builds from there. And you can see that the strategy began working. Again, I'm not making a causal argument here about the percent of new homes with gas stoves. This is a very complex fact, but I just want to show this trend as we go. Again, emphasizing inconclusive, uncertainty, and also funding research. So this is a snapshot of the studies available in the early 1980s, and you can see that the 4 big epidemiological studies that were not funded by the gas industry did find an association with asthma, and then the 2 that were industry funded did not. Again, just from that, you can't make direct conclusions, but it's worth noting. And so you can see this trend reversed right around this period when Operation Attack was implemented and has not turned back. But again, the Hill and Knowlton advised the industry to stay vigilant. And so when the latest batch of studies on gas stoves came out, of course, they implement their strategy again, emphasizing uncertainty and publishing their own industry-funded research. So I'm just going to go skip through this a little bit faster because I think we have a little bit more on this, or we saw all those ads and whatnot, and I'm happy to talk more in Q&A. But just some relatively recent AGA releases. So this playbook is so common and so shared among industries that a scholar, Jennifer Jaquette, actually just distilled it into the playbook, which I highly recommend that anyone in public health read to familiarize themselves with this particular playbook. And again, these PR firms really play this important role, learning from different industries and then taking those lessons to other industries as well, so that this playbook is not siloed. So it's not a very uplifting story about the power of science, frankly, because the dangers of pollution from gas stoves used to be total common sense in the early 1900s. We now know a lot more. The science has improved, and yet we've lost the common sense. In 2024, it's totally normal to find a gas stove with no vent hood and a closed window. So unfortunately, more science does not necessarily mean more common sense. And that is our job as science communicators. So a huge thanks to all our collaborators, to Stanford, Central California Asthma Collaborative, and the Jackson Lab in particular that has really spearheaded a lot of this work. Thanks so much. I'll throw it back.
Hey, thank you so much, Yannai. So we're going to talk a little bit kind of quickly about what the study looks like in New York. And I have to start by thanking Paul Kiesler, Deepa Prasad, Susie Ross, I don't know if Gabe Recchio is on, Roger Downs, who've all been doing the heavy lifting, administering these tests. And also want to thank a ton of you who are on here who've let us into your homes. The only way folks like you and I can do their work is if we provide data points. So one thing I would love to, if you have a gas stove and we haven't come tested you, if you can send me a text in the chat with your phone number and where you are in the state, we would love to come out and test. So I'll tell for folks who have not been part of this, there was a similar study that was done in Washington, D.C. and Montgomery County, Maryland by the Sierra Club and a group, I believe, called Beyond Gas. And we sort of went, oh, that's a smart idea. Let's do it here and see what the results look like. We got nitrogen dioxide detectors from the New World Foundation, gave us a bunch of money for a grant. By the time we were really ready to buy them, they were expensive. The Sierra Club helped us with another $1,000 because the price had gone up or whatever. And we started doing the tests. The way the tests work is we come to a home, we run the nitrogen dioxide detector for 3 to 5 minutes in the nearest bedroom to the kitchen with the stove turned off. Then we come back into the kitchen for another 3 to 5 minutes and run the detector with the stove turned off to establish a baseline. Then turn the stove on for half an hour, continuing to get data points every single minute. And then we leave the stove on, go back to the bedroom, and test from there for another 3 to 5 minutes to get a sense of how the gases are migrating around the domicile. And it's been sort of staggering. I mean, one of the things that's happened to me, and I've been interested in this, is that there's a great deal of difference between hearing this many parts per million and this da-da-da-da, and doing it while somebody's child is walking through a kitchen or the dog is sitting there or the grandparents are in the next room. It's been extraordinary. What I've observed, and we have enough of the testers on here and people who've been tested that during the Q&A, anything you guys want to say, bring that into. And I know that Brady is interested in sort of looking at doing more of this citizen science. And I think she's interested in hearing from folks who've been tested about how that experience could be better, what we could provide that would help you more. But what we've seen, there are two numbers. There's a California Air Resources Board number that was promulgated on November 19th. They're still deciding whether it's the number they're going to accept, but it's the number the scientists are pushing there, which is 0.027 parts per million. In about 98% of the homes, we seem to be exceeding that number. I mean, this is me and sort of looking at data, and I went to public school in Texas, so take it with a grain of sand. The other number is World Health Organization has a number for outdoor air pollution, and we seem to be exceeding that in at least 70% of the homes that we're going into. And I actually wonder whether Brady or Yannai want to talk about, is that consistent with numbers you're seeing? And we're not, and there's nothing about this, by the way, we're not looking at formaldehyde or benzene or carbon monoxide. So this is just one thing, and God knows what the rest of that is. Did Yannai or Brady want to say anything?
Sure. I can say again, kind of at a high level, qualitatively, that ratio seems roughly in line with a lot of a lot of what we've seen. Again, broad strokes, but a small apartment, very easy to exceed the WHO 100 part per billion benchmark. And without active ventilation, it can stay, elevated like that for an hour, which is what it takes to exceed the benchmark. And then a bigger house, if you've got, multiple burners or a burner and oven, also not that hard to exceed. So unless you're in a McMansion, it's pretty darn easy.
We will, when we have a study done and all of the folks who participated, you're anonymized, as we've said, I'm going to try and get that out to everybody who's been tested so you can really see this in a real way. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kathy Nolan, who's a pediatrician and also a county legislator in Ulster County. So, Kathy?
Thank you very much. And thank you for that presentation and the discussion that we're already having. It's really good because using gas stoves indoors is really unhealthy. And we need people to know that, and not everybody does. Really, combusting anything indoors is unhealthy. In many parts of the world, people cook with dung, and they have even more health problems than what we're showing here. But the idea that in a well-developed country that we would be combusting a product indoors that has these kind of contaminants in it, it's really remarkable that we have gone that direction. These contaminants been listed here: nitrous oxide, carbon monoxide, as well as carbon dioxide emitted, and benzene and formaldehyde, methane and carbon dioxide being the greenhouse gases, the others being really toxins, health toxins. And I would also add particulate matter. I'll talk a little bit about why I think particulate matter really matters. That's small particles. You might think of it as soot or carbon, but often very tiny, parts per million. And it's not surprising to me that the techniques used to convince people to cook with gas are similar to those that were used to convince people to smoke cigarettes and keep smoking cigarettes. Strangely enough, these two activities really have a lot of parallels in terms of their health impacts. So you have the direct inhalation of a cigarette by a cigarette smoker is very similar to somebody who's right above the stove cooking, especially if it's not vented. And then you have what we might think of as a kind of secondary smoke, kind of passive smoker that has become more talked about in medicine over the past couple of decades, where secondhand smoke affects people even if they're not themselves smoking. And then there's third-hand smoke, which is where the contaminants settle out of the air over time onto surfaces and then can be picked up from those surfaces. And I don't think the research that we're doing on gas stoves yet has gone into all of those levels. But this research showing that the contaminants go throughout the house and into the bedrooms is really very much akin to the notion of secondhand smoke. And the levels that Tim was just mentioning that we get to with the indoor smoke, with the indoor cooking, are very similar to the levels of these contaminants you get with a smoker in your household. So if people have given up smoking in order to improve the health or the health of their family, but they're still using that gas stove, they've still got almost an equal amount of work yet to do to really get the relief from those possible health effects. So the health effects are primarily respiratory disease, particularly asthma, and they're worse in children and infants and people with pre-existing conditions. As was mentioned, the contribution of gas cooking stoves to asthma across the country is probably around 12 to 13%. And in New York State, it's more than that, so more near 17, 18%. So we could be talking about as many as 1 out of 5 children or adults having their asthma either caused or exacerbated because of these exposures that come from cooking indoors with both natural gas, and somebody mentioned in the chat about propane. These would be similar, I think, findings with propane. We can ask Yannai as a chemist if he agrees, but my feeling is that you're going to get quite a few of the same kinds of exposures. In addition to respiratory disease, you can have cardiovascular disease, and increasingly there is concern about cancer, particularly with benzene, and maybe also with formaldehyde that would be present as a co-contaminant. And these are effects that you can see over time, but the exposures, if they continue over time, you're likely to see increasing incidence of these. Public health people are now more aware of this, but clinicians and the average person may not be aware. And I consider it part of our responsibility now that we know this to make sure that other people know this. And if health professionals don't know it, it means that they may have a person coming into their office with asthma and not know to ask the question, are you cooking indoors with natural gas, propane? And the answer to that question could give them a way in to possibly reducing the severity of that condition, or if the person isn't yet showing a disease, preventing a disease. So I think Brady's going to talk a little bit more about some of the ways that we can intervene. There are alternatives to using gas indoors. There is cooking outdoors. A lot of people told me during COVID, when they were barbecuing outdoors, that they had better health. I'm just beginning to question, well, maybe was that because they weren't having their lower level respiratory conditions set off? So getting out of the kitchen can avoid some of the spikes. And I also want to talk with this group about the possibility that in some instances, HEPA filters, if a family or a person cannot avoid having a gas stove, can they use a filter system in their house, and will that help? And I'm going to argue without a lot of data to back me up that it might. The data that I do have is that in households near fracking sites, which have a lot of these same contaminants and a lot of particulate matter, if you use a HEPA filter, which takes the particulate matter out of the air, a lot of the aromatic hydrocarbons, the HAPs, formaldehyde, benzene, and other BTEX chemicals will stay on the particles and be pulled out. And so know of personal instances, and there is some emerging data that having a very high level filtration system running can be somewhat protective. It's very expensive, not at this point covered by insurance, but it might be something for a really sticky situation if somebody is really being exposed and becoming ill, which is, I'm afraid to say, I think if you're being exposed, you are highly at risk of becoming ill if that exposure continues over time. So we really need to continue with these efforts to get these appliances out of our home and reduce these exposures. So I'll stop there and hand things back over to Tim.
Thank you, Kathy, so much. I will just mention Kathy's also working on an initiative to get intake forms for physicians to, just like they ask, do you smoke cigarettes, to ask whether or not you have a gas stove in your residence. I'm excited now to turn this over to Brady Seals, who's at Stanford and is a swell, to talk about what you do if you have a gas stove.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, everybody. Really, thank you for being here. Thank you for those who volunteered your homes or were volunteered by testing other folks' homes. I'm originally from New York, and my parents volunteered and got their home in Yorktown Heights tested, but I don't see them here, so I will be texting them after this to tell them that they have been slacking. But just, it's really incredible because I think how we're seeing the change is in Zoom rooms like this. It's people hearing the stories, and we're up against a big industry that's very powerful, but when people know about the health impacts, it is so powerful. I'm just going to share one very quick slide with you, which is what to do if you do have a gas stove, and in 3 buckets. So can you see my screen okay? Great. First things is that there are some free things that we can do that we know have been effective. Cooking on the back burners can make, if you do have a range hood, it's more effective. Also, if you do have an induction stove and are worried about EMF or electromagnetic fields, giving space between burners is always good. So getting in the practice of cooking on the back burners. Using your range hood if you have one. So we know this is an imperfect solution, but most people don't use theirs. Opening a window, installing or checking your carbon monoxide detectors. So folks who do have specifically underlying cardiovascular conditions, carbon monoxide alarms are designed to go off in time to save our lives, like in time to get out with our lives, their life safety. They don't alert us at lower level concentrations that can be potentially bad for health. And gas stove use over time is one of those that provides low level concentration. So if you do have an underlying health condition, you can get a low level carbon monoxide detector that will alert you at lower thresholds. For some of the benzene leakage that Yannai had talked about, tightening the fittings at the end back of your stove where the tailpipe ends at your stove is one way to potentially help address where those leaks are coming. So those are kind of the things to do. You can hopefully do right away. The second gray box is the next step 2, which would be things that may cost a bit more, but how do we use less gas? Transition our cooking to things like toaster ovens, air fryers, electric kettles, buying a plug-in induction cooktop, a single or double burner that you can plug in. I've seen really inventive, cutting boards on top of the gas stove, or cookie sheets turned over with your gas stove right there under your range hood. And then, like Kathy was saying, using an air cleaner, a HEPA air cleaner, can be effective at reducing pollution, particularly if you find one that has a carbon filter. And the carbon filter is what you want for the gases, like the nitrogen dioxide. And then finally, removing that polluting source. So that's switching to electric options. I recognize as a renter myself that this is very challenging if you don't own your home, but talking to your property manager, talking to your landlord about things that they can do. And yeah, I would just love to hear if you are someone who's volunteered in this community science, if anything, if your behavior has changed or if any of participating in this has changed. I'd love if you would just put in the chat or share a comment as we think about how can we replicate the amazing work that's happening with community science, science from the communities in New York into other parts of the country. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Brady. So I'm going to just really quickly talk about a bill that we have here in New York for New York folks. I think we're mostly New York folks here. Let's see. Why am I not sharing that screen? I'm not sharing. So sorry. Anyhow, studies show that the average American has no idea about the health consequences of gas stoves. So luckily, Senators Kruger and Assemblymember Solage have responded to that with something called the Healthy Homes Right to Know Act. I'll put this in the chat. It's S1280B and A73B. And what this bill does, all the bill does, is requires warning labels on new gas stoves. It has zero fiscal implication for the state. So, the state's frequent thing about we don't have the money to spend, we can't, well, there's no money to spend. All that it does is helps let people understand that gas stoves emit these dangerous combustion byproducts that people are unaware of. So it is an education bill and a public health bill. Chef Galarza, who's going to talk to you in a minute, once said to me, if somebody wants to withhold knowledge from the public, you should probably question their motives. And I think that that's a really smart thing. So last year, the bill made it through the Senate, was voted on the Senate floor with one Republican who voted for it, but it had no debate around it. It's currently in the Commerce Committee. There are two Democratic senators who we'd love to get on board. Senator Martinez actually voted for it on the floor last year. She's not a co-sponsor. If you're a constituent of hers, or Senator Zellner, who's new, please give them a call. We have a ton of, this isn't even all of them, co-sponsors in the Assembly, 68 or 70 or something like that. We want to get some more. These are folks who are not co-sponsors yet. If any of these folks are your representatives, please give them a call. Yeah, so I will put the numbers, a thing in the chat with a link to what the bill looks like and a link so you can find your assembly member and your senator, as well as something that'll get you to their phone number. And then lastly, I'll just say, we're doing great work with these tests, but we'd love to do more tests. So please, if you have a gas stove and are willing, as you can see, we've done a lot in certain areas, but we want to geographically cover the state. So that's what I have there. I'm really excited to have my friend Chef Chris Galarza, who's a real cook. He doesn't burn water the way I do. So Chef's going to talk, because this always comes up. We're not here to sell induction stoves to anybody, but people always ask a little bit about them. And so, Chef?
Yeah, so welcome, everybody. Thank you for having me. I'll tell you that as someone who has spent his entire life cooking, who has dedicated his life and career to this, the first thing I look at is, how is this going to impact how I cook? Is this going to be better or worse? I would never advocate for anything that's going to make my cooking, my craft, worse. And I can tell you firsthand, as one of those chefs that originally said over my dead body, this is by far the best technology or the best way of cooking I've ever experienced. not only am I able to cook faster, and for anyone who's in the commercial world, we're able to nearly double the throughput or the amount of food that we produce from 38.6 to 70.9 um, for the nerds out there. But we're also able to do it safely, right? So what I mean by that is that the kitchen is not only devoid of these harmful pollutants, but it's also comfortable, right? I don't like to cook in a hot kitchen, despite the fact that I made this my career. So when I cook in kitchens that are electrified, we did a study in my kitchen, and it was around 74 degrees Fahrenheit from the traditional 100, 130 degrees. So it's a big drop. And that is because of induction, right? Induction uses electromagnetic currents to heat the metal itself very, very fast. It is completely safe. Handles don't get hot, which means cooking with kids are safe. If you don't like to clean, that's fine. I've actually done demos where I've put down a towel, cooked the entire dish, and picked up the towel. No harm, no foul, no burning, no nothing. Just it captured all the splatter, right? It was easier to clean. It made my kitchen cooler, which means in the summer months, we weren't using as much air conditioning, which saved us on electricity. The refrigeration wasn't running on and off as often, which means that these things that we're buying for our homes, for our kitchens, are going to last longer. So it's just a kind of like when you throw a pebble into a body of water, right? That ripple effect. It's just such a positive ripple effect that I can't even describe it. I can spend all day talking about. I just left a space where I was talking to a bunch of architects, where I had about 2 hours and it still wasn't enough. So there is so much here, but suffice to say, cooking with induction is faster, it's cleaner, it's easier to maintain, and it just refines your technique, refines what you can do, because you can cook anything. There's no cooking technique you can't access. Cooking is about fundamentals and techniques. So it doesn't matter if you're cooking on a campfire, a gas range, an induction range, a saute is a saute, a braise is a braise. The conversation we're having here is, how do we want to heat up a piece of metal? Do we want to do it in a way that fills our spaces with bad chemicals that are obviously bad for us, our kids, our elderly, or do we want to do it in a way that is more efficient, is safer, and can allow us to pass on those traditions? And how am I on time?
I want to ask you to say one thing, which you've said to me, which astounds me, and maybe I'm wrong. You've told me that the top cooking competitions are now all done on induction.
Yeah,
Is that right?
Every international culinary competition in the world, and that includes the Bocuse d'Or, the Culinary Olympics. And if you didn't know, there is the Culinary Olympics every 4 years. We compete as chefs to see who is the best culinary country in the world, and it's all electric. And it's not done for any ideological reasons. It's done for two reasons. The one, it is far easier to get electricity into a space than there is to get gas. Because gas, you have to literally move heaven and earth to get all this dirt out of the way, to move pipes and all these things. When electricity, you just run wire, you're good, you're done. The other is the level of precision, right? Because before, we would say, hey, Tim, on the line, I'm going to need you to sear off some short ribs and braise it on medium low for 6 hours. Well, what does that mean, right? You can sear meat, but not far. I like a really deep sear, right? Close to burn. I want a really deep sear. I want to caramelize all that protein. That's going to yield the better product. But then when I say medium low, what does that mean? Well, are those flames blue? Are those flames orange? When was the last time they were serviced? Are they barely on? Because you can't under and over braise meats. But if I were to say, Tim, could you sear off those short ribs for 400 degrees Fahrenheit at 4 minutes on each side and braise it at 185 for 6 hours? Now we have consistency. And when you're competing at these, when you're achieving a Michelin star or you're pursuing the Olympics, that consistency matters. At that level, we do not measure things in teaspoons or in cups. We measure things by grams, because, as I've said to many chefs, the most expensive thing in any restaurant isn't the tomahawk steak or saffron. It's an empty seat. And nothing contributes more to an empty seat than inconsistency.
Chef, can I just say that if you had me on the line to braise those ribs, you'd have a lot of empty seats. So I'm glad you don't.
I would go
So
under, immediately.
Thank you so much. So we're going to
course.
jump to questions. And I think the first one, the great prop genius, Jesse Walker, just wrote oven versus stovetop use. I wonder, seems to me this is a Yannai Brady question about what do we see in terms of emissions. Is there a difference between the oven and the stovetop?
I mean, in one sense, a burner is a burner, and we haven't really seen systematic differences in emission rates for all the pollutants per unit gas burn, say. On the other hand, your oven's often going to be on cycling for a longer time than burners, if you're using it, in a residential context at least, maybe not commercial, but so we generally see kind of higher plateaus with ovens just because of the use pattern.
Here's another question, and you're going to have to explain what the hell it means. What is the MV with the PPMV?
PPMV stands for parts per million by volume. So if I have a liter of air, how many microliters of pollution is in there?
Do high-end brands address any of this? What are the healthiest brands of stoves? Do you see a difference between them?
Big difference, no gas.
In the residential context, NO2, no, it's about how much gas you burn. And for benzene, we see a lot of variation between the stoves, but we tried to correlate with brand, with age, with everything we could think of. And you're just playing roulette.
I think this question went into the chat at the time you were talking about the very large differences in measurements of benzene across
so we
cities.
do see.
So is there a brand of gas, or I guess your chart shows where in the country and then where in the world you don't want to be using gas even more?
A brand of gas. States. Right. For gas supply, brand and geography go together. So you can look at our geographical map. Yeah, for that.
How do you know if you have a leak?
Well, it's an interesting question because everyone has a leak at some threshold. It just matters how big a leak. Very few people are going to have a leak that is immediately a danger from a perspective of explosion risk. That's extremely rare and easily detected, usually if you have a good sense of smell. And then it's really hard to detect if you have a much smaller leak. Honestly, you need kind of more specialized equipment because even these rovers, are calibrated to detecting flammable levels. Sorry.
I think
Moira says, "How do you get tested?" Moira, you tell me you want to get tested, and I'll come over.
Go back for a second. I think Brady had to leave, but she did mention those carbon monoxide detectors that are not just detecting when you have a leak that's at the point that will kill you, but that will actually measure. And so maybe one of those that you can get at the hardware store. If you're measuring high levels of carbon monoxide, then you should get everything else tested probably. And I think the notion of just assuming that you have a leak, unless you've been tested, is much better. I mean,
I got this on Amazon for like $20-$30.
Is that for carbon monoxide?
Can't remember exactly what, but I was smelling something coming off a furnace because we have an older home, and had the gas company come out. They're like, "No, there's nothing here." And I was like, "I keep smelling it." So I bought it. I found the leak, had them come out here and fix it. So definitely good to have.
But don't wait to find out that you have leaking from your appliances before you switch out and make these changes. Make the changes.
Robin, you wrote a lot about the work you guys have done with green schools, and I will connect you with the science people. Um, sorry, I'm spinning through these as quickly as I can. Um, da, 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 da. Here's someone. Tim came and tested my house. Propane stove not vented. We have switched to cooking more with an air fryer and are planning to get an induction stove. Here's Karen writes, wonder about the greenhouse gas emissions from all the backyard gas grills. You got anything on that?
Yeah, that's a drop in the bucket. Those backyard gas grills generally use from a climate change perspective. Yeah, they first of all they use propane, and actually propane is less of a climate issue than methane than natural gas because it degrades so quickly. And the amount of CO2 you're producing from those is tiny compared to everything else.
Let's see. Can you talk about the EMF fear that folks have about induction?
I can talk.
Go.
Yeah, so there's a big fear around the EMF for some reason. I looked into this years ago, and there was a study done in London specific to telephone wires. People were afraid of telephone wires, and they found that they were regularly emitting around 10,000, I think it was nanoteslas of emission or of radiation. And I also found someone who did a similar test on induction and found that they were emitting around 3,000. The conclusion on the London study was that it's perfectly safe. There's no harmful radiation to a person because it's non-ionizing radiation. So if you can live under a telephone wire, you can certainly have an induction range.
Yeah, and then there's I think there are some subpopulations that might have elevated concern. For instance, if you have a device in you that communicates using EMF, right? I think these are still pretty minimal and maybe getting more minimal as the technology develops, but there have been some concerns, for instance, with pacemakers. I'm not an expert on this, but the other thing I would just note is if you are in one of these subpopulations where there was some specific concern rate, like for instance, if you have a pacemaker, if you're not going for the Chef Olympiad, then a smooth top coil range, you got rid of all the pollution and you have no induction either. So that's a choice as well.
So I think I'm through the questions. If anybody has a question and wants to raise your hand or just say, I have a question in the chat, or if any of the folks who've done testing wanted to say anything about that they've experienced. And otherwise, I know you've all been here for a while.
Wait, one quick question. Are you looking at bringing this beyond New York? I know this is a New York group, but is that possible?
So I know that there's testing going on in Baltimore, Maryland, and Illinois right now.
I feel like Massachusetts would be very interested, and possibly Maine and some other states that we're working with. So let me know.
Yeah, and I think at least my thought initially, and when I sold this to the New World Foundation for the grant, my thought was to get this study done and then move these monitors on to another state where testing could continue.
Sure.
So the citizen science can build. I should mention too that while New York has a labeling bill, so does Massachusetts and Illinois. California had one passed there. The governor, I think, my own opinion, didn't sign it for political reasons, but it's still there and hopefully will resurrect itself. Colorado passed one. It's being legally challenged by industry. And we'll see how that turns out, but that's also not unusual kind of when you look at the history of cigarette labeling, et cetera, that folks do that kind of thing. Susie Ross, did you have something?
I just wanted to say that as somebody who's been tested and also has been testing, that as I got my first test, I was obviously very shocked at the results of my stove. And I do actually at this point use my toaster oven, and and have an induction stovetop that sits on top of my stove. So I learned myself, but in going through people's homes, it is incredible to have the one-on-one experience with people where everyone is learning together. And I just feel like it is such an unbelievable way to connect with people, in a way that, all the information here has been wonderful, but it's, people get information overload. And this practice has really created an incredible halo effect. And just want to say thank you for all the work that's being done here and the cooperation and the coordination. It's been great.
Hey, Susie, and you certainly don't have to share this, do you want to talk briefly about your vent?
That my vent doesn't work and I have to open my door now?
But Susie has a very nice stove, and the vent wasn't helpful. So
not at all. No, it was circulating inside. So I was basically it was actually on. I don't even know if it was recirculating. It just makes a lot of noise. And that seems to be, I think, a lot of what some people are learning is that not only does it not operate efficiently, and we think that when we turn on, I haven't been to a single person's home, I think, that doesn't use the vent, but they've learned whether it's actually going out or just recirculating in. And yeah.
Thank you. Hey, Bonnie, go.
I have it's over 100-year-old stove, 2 ovens, and I try to use my electric burners in another room, but it still has 3 pilots running and I can't turn them off. So am I getting polluted from that, or is it only when you turn the burners on and cook?
Yeah, if there's a flame, there's pollution. Unfortunately, it's less per unit time. The flame is smaller than if it were on, but the flip side is it's always on. I'll just tease too, and Chris can speak more to this. But our results from commercial kitchens, which have lots of pilot lights. In some kitchens, actually, the pollution levels are higher at night because they turn off all the ventilation, but the pilot lights stay on, and so the pollution builds up.
Yeah.
So I should always have the window open.
I'm sorry?
I should always have the window open.
Well, you don't want to freeze yourself out. Yeah, for residential stoves that have a pilot, those are incredibly rare, because of their age. But they're, to put into perspective, they're emitting about 100 BTUs worth of energy. Your residential burners, presumably around 10,000 BTUs. So it is a fraction of the size, but to Yannai's point, it is on constantly. So, maybe not, it might not be a bad idea if it is venting to the outside. Periodically, just turn the fan on, evacuate the space, and then go on about your day.
Okay.
A periodic flush will have as Chef Chris suggests, a great impact on your average concentrations.
There was a mention in the chat about making sure people knew that gas testing was free. It takes about 50 minutes in and out the door. I actually have a question for Dr. Nolan, which is there was a study published in The Lancet this year looking at outdoor long-term exposure to nitrogen dioxide and particulate matter and the onset of dementia. And there's similar studies linking nitrogen dioxide in long-term, again, outdoor exposure to increased chances of breast cancer, prostate cancer, and colorectal cancers. And I'm curious how, because it seems to me logical, but I'm not a doctor, so I want to be careful, that if you have a gas stove where you're also getting that stuff indoors, it's certainly not helping those outcomes, even though presumably the similar testing hasn't been done on indoor stuff.
My take on it is that if the volumes, the concentrations are the same, then the studies that are done outdoors or indoors are about exposures to certain concentrations. And so those studies should be comparable. So I am quite worried about that. There are some concerning studies of many of these contaminants with behavior in children and cognitive function, more with particulate matter than with some of the other contaminants. It can be hard to sort out which exposure is causing what outcome. So as a scientist, that is important because we'd like to be able to discern that. Part of the reason I get a little bit pushy about let's make changes when we can, if at all possible, is that as a clinician, I don't have to have that level of certainty. If I have a study outdoors that shows that nitrous oxides are causing dementia, then I'm going to be very worried that the same exposures indoors are going to have that same effect. And so all of these studies cumulatively say that we should not be exposing ourselves to this if we have any other choice.
Right. Thank you. Any other questions?
What was a question on how to get tested?
Bonnie, if you send me a private message in the chat with your phone number and where you are, we will get you tested.
Okay, great. I'm in New York City, Manhattan.
Great. You can send a private message to Paul Kiesler, and he will come himself and do it if he's still on.
Yes.
But you can send the information to me, and I'll set that up. Yannai, Chris, Dr. Nolan, do you have any final thoughts before we let people enjoy their nights?
I mean, I would say that the work that you're doing and the conversation that's being spurred because of it is the most dangerous thing to the status quo, and I am here for it. There's a reason that they're spending an enormous amount of money to block people from having access to information, and that kind of gives the game away. So stay educated, keep having these conversations, let this information spread like the plague, and let's make it, let's have a positive change in our world for a change.
Thank you. And just to, as kind of a corollary to Chef Chris, I'll just say, it would be purely demoralizing to be pointing out the harms of the status quo if there weren't a solution that also separately made the cooking experience better. And so it's great having champions like Chef Chris showing that this is not a matter of sacrifice for the case of climate or health. This is actually just an improvement overall.
And I would just say, let's each take action at some level. And if you can take action at more than one level, great. Your own kitchen, your support for others who are making these changes, and then support at the policy level, so that at the very least we get information to people of the harms as they might be purchasing a new stove. And even better, in New York, we had almost happening the changing over so that you wouldn't have gas automatically supplied into large buildings. Let's keep those policy changes going as far forward as we can.
And if I could just jump in to that note, Yannai teased that there's a study coming for commercial kitchens. I think when that comes out, Tim, if you can share that with the group and have everyone share with their, with their local congressperson or assembly person, whatever that is, or senator, because one of the reasons people are hesitant to change is because they think that chefs are going to be up in arms about it. And nothing has, and don't get me wrong, a lot of chefs are up in arms about it. But nothing has changed those conversations more than education. And when we have had conversations with chefs, almost unanimously, they're like, oh, yeah, if there's a better way of doing it, all I care about is cooking. It doesn't matter. And if we can change the perception of how chefs would react to this and change the way that people think about what chefs are exposing themselves to, then there could possibly be, for lack of a better term, change coming down the pike.
So I want to just thank everybody. The Healthy Homes Right to Know Act, by the way, doesn't force anybody to change their stove over. It just says, let's give people the information they need, like a cigarette pack, to make your own decision. So that's common sense policy that should be supported by both sides of the aisle. If you have an opportunity, please contact your legislator. One thing we didn't mention, and I'll stop because we could probably all go on and on and on about this, is one of the things that is also really important to recognize is that these emissions affect different populations very, very differently, especially when you're looking at asthma. Black children die 8 times as often as white children. Black adults have asthma twice as often as white adults. According to the T.H. Chan School of Public Health, they did a study that showed women are profoundly more affected by all of this than men, probably because women are still doing the lion's share of the cooking. Hispanic adults have the highest rate of current asthma of any population. So, and as Yannai mentioned, there are correlations between the size of a building envelope and concentrations. That would suggest, in some cases, economic differences play a part in all of this. So there's also a kind of moral thing in my mind around this in terms of environmental justice. But I, again, can't thank you all enough for showing up tonight. Please spread the word. And thank you so much, Yannai and Chris and Kathy, and I think Brady's left, but thank you, Brady. Thank you, Paul Kiesler, and hope to see you all again soon.